Okay, good morning to folks on the West Coast of the United States. Good evening to folks in Europe and elsewhere further east. This is the inaugural feature group, we're calling it a feature group, I think, discussion in Cluster API for managed Kubernetes. So I'll say the standard disclaimer stuff, I think that's appropriate. We are meeting on behalf of Cluster API, which is a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct, so please use the raise hand feature, and I or another host will happily call on you. Be kind to one another, be open, be curious. Welcome, everyone. So to folks who don't know me, my name is Jack Francis. I work at Microsoft doing Cluster API and Kubernetes things with a focus on Azure. We're certainly here, I think, to represent the generic cross-provider, non-specific provider story for managed Kubernetes. So it's great to see so many people here. I'll go ahead and share the agenda doc. Does that do the trick? I think so. So this is essentially, a copy pasta fork of the CAPI agenda doc. So we'll scroll down here. I'll do this for me. Feel free to sign yourself in. Whoops, no, I'm not Jack Microsoft. Only in my weirdest dreams am I Jack Microsoft. Okay. Since this is our inaugural meeting, and someone pointed out in Slack that I haven't done the sort of correct thing and invited folks via the Google group for, I think, SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Maybe we can just sort of focus today's meeting on introductions. I put a couple of agenda items to make sure to call out the scope as it's currently defined in the proposal doc, so we can make sure that folks have lots of time to criticize that. And I don't foresee scope being super strict or super concrete, but I think it helps, especially for folks who are driving by and want to know if they should be spending their valuable time with us every week or every 2 weeks for 30 minutes. It helps to have some definition of what we're aiming towards. So maybe, since this is the first discussion, do we want to do a roundtable discussion? Everybody raise your hand and brief who you are and maybe where you are with managed Kubernetes and Cluster API. And I would say this is optional, so if you don't feel like you're up for that, that's totally great. So for everyone who raises their hand, I will go ahead and call in an arbitrary order, and then just lower your hand after you're done so I can keep an accounting. All right, so I'm just going to go top down from what I see in my window, which is going to be different from other folks, but Abhijit, sorry if I butchered your name. Go ahead and
Jack.
Say hi.
Yeah.
Hi.
Good morning to everyone, and good evening to who are on my time zone or in Europe. So my name is Abhijit Das. I'm part of the VMware group based in Bangalore. So we are the TKGS group. So we are providing the Kubernetes as a guest cluster over vSphere. So I'm part of the group, and currently I'm working on cluster autoscaler along with classic cluster. So have some issues on that. So I had discussed something similar on the autoscaling group, but it has CAPI dependency also. So wanted to discuss it over on this forum also.
Cool, welcome. Thank you so much for saying hi. Joe, you're next in my view.
Hey, I'm Joe Kratzit with Oracle, working on the Cluster API and trying to work with the managed Kubernetes for our Kubernetes offering. We've kind of followed the previous managed Kubernetes proposal. I'm not sure if we're the first one, but we're one of the ones that are following that. I know there's other big providers that have kind of gone their own path. And so we wanted to be a part of the discussion to kind of figure out where we can go from here.
Wonderful, welcome. John H., you're up next.
Everyone, I'm John Hune. I work with Jack at Microsoft on Cluster API and CabZ type stuff. I started working on Cluster API and CabZ about 3 months ago, so I'm still fairly green, but getting the hang of things, and yeah, looking forward to getting more done on managed clusters.
Cool. Richard, you're up next.
Hi everyone, Richard. I work at SUSE. So I am a maintainer of the AWS provider. I did the original, or a lot of the original work for EKS in Kappa. And I guess relevant to this, I am one of the co-authors of the original managed Kubernetes proposal along with Winnie.
Sorry, a little late to the mute button. Winnie, you're next.
Hi, this is Winnie. I work at VMware. So I work on like Kubernetes and Cluster API, basically Kubernetes in our company. And yeah, I co-authored the original managed Kubernetes proposal with Richard because I was working on EKS. So yeah, looking forward to seeing what we can do here.
Great. Okay, Alex, you're next.
Yeah, I'm Alex. I work at SUSE specifically on Rancher. We're looking into CAPI and into smoother integration of CAPI and managed Kubernetes.
Great. Erwin.
Hi, I'm Erwin. I'm working for Plasma9. We've also been working at our integration into Cluster API. Very excited about it, and we're also at the stage, looking at managed Kubernetes more. Yeah, so I'm happy to at least listen in and help out where possible.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I think that's all the hands I see, at least. So I see that it's just me for agenda items, so I'm going to go straight to the scope thing. But if anybody, based on this conversation, or just have been sort of queuing up something you'd like to talk about, feel free to just pop that onto the stack below mine, and we'll get to this after. Let me do a quick link stress test to make sure I can get to the PR. Is the PR linked here? Maybe it's not. Oh, it's literally here. Okay, cool. So if I click on this, and so this is a PR that's meant to land in CAPI, sort of defining this feature group. So this is the first instance of this thing in CAPI. So, you know, we're probably going to get it a little wrong, but I thought it was useful to sort of just document what we're doing as a way of aiding discovery for other folks who would like to be here but don't know that we exist. And again, someone on Slack suggested that I think the CAPI Google group is also an appropriate place to blast this info. But I wanted to discuss what I've sort of, so it's a short doc, which is hopefully useful to folks. I wanted to discuss the way we define our scope. And I actually thought there was an update. Maybe I haven't pushed this. I need to refresh this. All right, well, we'll work with this super concise one for now. So what I've got so far is that we are scoped to standardizing managed Kubernetes solutions across the cluster API provider ecosystem. So there's not a lot of detail there, but the reason that was my initial go is to sort of emphasize that the key problem that we want to be solving is the lack of consistency across providers for managed Kubernetes. So as Winnie and Richard, I think earlier mentioned, let me just do this the old-fashioned way. Seems like most folks are aware of this proposal, but I'll dial it up just for fun. They spent a lot of time developing kind of I mean, Winnie, feel free to chime in here, but my read is kind of half of a observation on the current state of managed Kubernetes across providers, and a sort of retrospective of, say, learnings, and then followed that along with some set of sort of concrete, at least somewhat concrete recommendations for new provider implementations going forward. So where is this? Am I in closed? Not here, maybe it's on the second page. It's been a while. Here we go, great. So this is a wonderful document that captures a lot of the historical sort of gotchas around how we have managed to do this. I mean, the key thing that when I read through this document is that there's a lot of different ways that we have managed sort of holistically, sorry, holistically is the wrong word, organically grown the managed Kubernetes space and cluster API from provider to provider. And I think one of the goals of this doc was to solve the problem I described earlier as far as consistency goes by recommending a path. Where can I find? I'm sort of familiar enough to know that it's the option 3 in here, the infamous option 3. So here we go. We don't have to like worry about internalizing this live in this meeting, but one of the intentions of this document was to try to solve as best as we could with the current scenario where there is no such thing as a managed Kubernetes primitive in cluster API. So it's up to us providers to figure out how to kind of compose the existing set of resource primitives into a solution. So this is a sort of concrete way that we might solve consistency if every provider were to adopt this. So I think this would go a long way towards that goal. But practically speaking, and Richard and Winnie can maybe speak to this, we know that this is probably not going to be feasible at least in the short term, maybe even in the long term. So I think we know right now that the Amazon, the AWS provider for EKS and the Azure provider for AKS are using a different option. And it's going to be non-trivial to sort of transition the way that the EKS and AKS solutions are to fit this option 3 recommendation going forward. It sounds like Oracle has benefited from this doc and has a working maintainable solution with option 3, which is fantastic. So again, this doc has been super valuable. Richard and Winnie, can you clarify that one of the reasons I'm talking about this is to just sort of build a case for considering another like follow-up task to this doc, which is to say building a managed Kubernetes spec into CAPI natively. But I want to talk through to make sure that's a good idea. So would either Richard or Winnie be able to chat about the state of EKS managed Kubernetes? Richard, go ahead, you're raising your hand. Thank you.
Yeah, I can talk to that. I guess probably one caveat to highlight right up front is when we wrote this proposal, we were given a strong direction that CAPI could not change. So that set the tone of this whole proposal. So yeah, so I guess the thing with Azure and the AWS implementations were they preceded this. So we had to go with what we thought. And actually the original implementations of both were the same, which is option 2 in this document, which is having this pass-through infrastructure cluster just to satisfy the contract with CAPI. AWS Pride then decided to realized actually having this separate kind that is just a pass-through was a bit pointless, and that we could satisfy the infrastructure cluster contract and the control plane contract via the same single instance, which we did. So then we moved on to something else, which was fine. Everything worked fine. And then cluster class came along. The cluster class assumes that the infrastructure cluster and the control plane reference from the CAPI cluster are 2 different resource kinds, which then basically means that Kappa cannot be used with cluster class for EKS clusters. So since then, we have moved back to our original implementation, which matches the Azure implementation, which is having this pass-through infrastructure cluster just to satisfy the contract. And really, when we say satisfy the contract, it's two things. It's set in the ready as true in the status, but also the control plane endpoint that we can see here. And this is probably one of the biggest bones of contention in this whole implementation. Is the control plane endpoint is assumed to be set via the infrastructure cluster, because traditionally CAPI was designed for non-managed EKS. So there was this assumption built in to its architecture that there would be a separate load balancer created that would handle communication to the control plane nodes. And now it's not applicable with managed Kubernetes, and actually the managed Kubernetes service does this. So we end up in this weird scenario where we have to put it on the infrastructure cluster. Great. So that infrastructure cluster has to watch the control plane, but the control plane won't start reconciling until the infrastructure cluster is ready. So there is this dance between these two reconcilers to satisfy everything and get a cluster provisioned. That's the, I guess, short answer.
Yeah, great. That makes sense to me, but I have a lot of background. So I'll try to summarize to maybe give multiple versions for other folks who don't have the background. It sounds to me that these options 1 and 2 as defined here are really like sort of like just descriptive rather than prescriptive options. These are observations of what folks have been doing. And so what I heard you describe, Richard, is that initially Kappa launched with something like option 1, and then ran into issues with cluster class compatibility. The thing we didn't speak to is the decision not to go to option 2. Sorry, not to go to option 3 after committing to cluster class compatibility, instead going to option 2. And I think we've had conversations. Is it fair to say that was a practical decision rather than a decision based on any architectural purity or anything like that?
Yeah, I guess it was a decision made so that we could support cluster class in the short term.
That's
so
right.
It's far easier to go to option 2 for us, because we don't have to plan for morphing our existing API over a period of time and worrying about migrations and deprecations of APIs and fields and stuff like that. So it was a very quick win for us to get us to cluster class.
Right. Okay. And I can speak really quickly to Azure's, what Azure is considering for, or I should say CAPC is considering. So CAPC, as Richard described, is using something like option 2. And, we want to be consistent. And so we have evaluated just going to option 3, and it's totally workable. I think that the main themes of this document are not controversial from CAPC maintainer perspective. It's just simply a practical consideration. It would be a ton of work. The main thing isn't the ton of work, it's the existing community of users that are currently relying on CAPC. And so this would constitute for them a breaking change. And so those practical concerns are things that we're weighing as far as the trade-offs going forward. I think the trade-off starts to make sense for CAPZ if all providers can agree to sort of break themselves and go towards the same pattern, because at least at that point we've achieved consistency. But that doesn't sound feasible. And so I think from CAPC's perspective, and it sounds like from Kappa's perspective, although I don't want to speak for Kappa, I'm trying to find the key sentence. There's a sentence here which describes that this is really operative for new implementations of managed Kubernetes, and existing implementations are sort of grandfathered in, so we're not breaking any rules. We're a self-governing community, so we get to make up the rules as we go along. So we can always agree upon a new consensus and sort of modify the rules. But I think that this document does sort of explicitly state that Kappa and CAPC are not sort of breaking the spirit of this document by not following the option 3 recommendation for new providers. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, which has an explicit non-goal, which was not to force existing implementations to have to go with the recommendation. And I think we probably also state it in the recommendation saying, yeah, option 3 is the best and what we should aim for. But if you have to go with option 2 or you're already there, then that's fine. because it satisfies cluster class. Incidentally, CapG, which is sort of used here as the GCP provider, is currently heading towards option 3, because that is a recommendation at this time. So we are adhering to this recommendation in here, which is option 3.
Great. And to be clear, CapG's managed Kubernetes implementation is new. So
yeah, it's currently being done right, as we speak.
got it. Cool. Great. So yeah, I think the TLDR is that this is something like a post-mortem, report from the front lines type thing that incorporates lots of learnings from Winnie and Richard from their history of doing managed Kubernetes. And for new folks, something like option 3 is probably going to get you into the least amount of trouble with respect to making this. Again, there's no managed Kubernetes primitive in Cluster API. So what Oracle has done, and it sounds like what CapG is doing in accordance with this for new managed Kubernetes implementations is great. And of course, for folks doing that work in option 3, we can make this proposal a living document. So feel free to incorporate your future learnings into this to maybe refine this if some of the language can be improved over time. So having said all that, is it controversial to conclude based on, this is just a sort of a limited set of all the learnings over the past couple of years, is it sensible to conclude that we are not going to achieve provider consistency without a cluster API primitive, which Richard said as of say a year ago or whenever that timeline was a non-starter in cluster API. But I think really my goal to spoil the twist in the plot here is to re-advocate, to get folks together to advocate in cluster API for a reconsideration of that position, so we can move managed Kubernetes into cluster API as a primitive, and then plan for a V2 type implementation of a standardized managed Kubernetes across providers. So does that make sense as a statement of scope? It's not, as I was reading this is super high level, but if we can all agree to something like that, then I can add a little bit more detail to suggest that the scope of this meeting is to advocate for managed Kubernetes in cluster API as a standard primitive resource, and to update the guidance for folks as that API evolves. Go ahead. I'm gonna actually call in Joe first. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, so from what it sounds like in the Cluster API office hours from KubeCon, there were not just us internally calling for managed Kubernetes to be, not using the word primitive, but be a part of the tooling. It sounded like an absolute ton of customers, a ton of users want that as well. So I think, moving it into that tool makes a lot of sense from my standpoint.
Cool. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, firstly, I'd rather rephrase it slightly to say that we reevaluate making changes to upstream CAPI to accommodate managed Kubernetes, not necessarily scoping it to, we have to have a separate kind or representation, because it might not need that. It might be, we just change the, where the control plane endpoint comes from, or various other things, which means, that might be easier, more consistent with unmanaged. So it'd be good to, I guess, give it a slightly wider scope, because I know that there is concern if we push for a separate managed representation. So it'd be good to consider other options as well.
Yeah, right. I definitely think that what we're actually going to end up discussing as a proposal into CAPI is a sort of moving target at this point. For me, in terms of what kind of outcome do I want to see? I want to see this type of option 1, option 2, option 3 being just not even possible. So I want to see something in CAPI that provides a happy path for all managed Kubernetes users, where they can't help but deliver an implementation that looks, provider A and provider B and provider C will follow the CAPI managed Kubernetes path. And at the end of that path, they're at the same place. So for users in 2024, however long this might take, users, especially users who are interested in multi-cloud managed Kubernetes, I think that's the sort of canonical use case. they have a really happy day where they're using Cluster API to do managed Kubernetes across Oracle, across Azure, across Google, across Amazon, and they're fulfilling a front end interface that is, every one of those resembles every other one. So the word primitive is a little metaphorical. I'm not sure you can even call a CRD a primitive, but something to the effect where we're just taking away this whole sort of like, we got a big menu, pick one. We recommend this one, but there's a whole bunch of other options. I would love to just have that be not even a factor. So we're almost at time. I do like these scoped to a half hour. So should we aim to do weekly, and then there's going to be a big break in the holidays, at least for the US dominated world that does Christmas and all that kind of thing. So let's maybe try to meet next week, and then at some point, if we have some momentum, we can probably change this to bi-weekly or maybe even monthly if there's an effective working async sort of working vibe. Okay, cool. And I'll send out the invitation in the Google group, and then I'll work with all you folks to maybe establish some communication medium where we don't have to try to fit everything into a half-hour discussion in real time and make progress on the stuff that folks have talked about. So this is going to be a long journey. Really excited to see all these people here. Joe, you just built a managed Kubernetes solution, so you're probably not super excited about re-architecting that and then asking your users to change. But I think the good news is it's going to take us a long time to get there. So it's not going to be tomorrow. All right, I think we should hop off before Yuvraj hops on and like, who's in this meeting? So let me stop sharing. Thank you very much, Winnie, for taking notes. Stop recording. I'll work with Fabrizio to post this to the CAPI YouTube channel, and also